Hey guys, tonight we're wandering into the smoky kitchens and shadowy gardens of the Middle Ages, where secrets weren't just whispered, they were steeped in boiling pots and hidden behind monastery walls. You hear the creak of a wooden gate, smell damp earth, and see a woman bent low among herbs that look ordinary to you but meant power to her. Her fingers pluck fennel and rue, her apron brushing against time, and you realize you've stepped into a world where controlling a family's future depended on knowledge so fragile it had to be passed down in hushed tones. And here's the cheeky reality check. If you tried half of these remedies today, you'd probably not survive long enough to complain about the side effects. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, because you might fall asleep during this story, and share only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and the local time in the comments so I can picture exactly where you're listening from across this spinning globe. Now, turn off the lights and lie down on your chair or bed, and let's begin tonight's journey together. You tread carefully on the uneven cobblestones of a medieval village. The houses are timber-framed, their thatched roofs dripping dew. In the small patch of soil behind each dwelling, women bend over their gardens, coaxing out not only food, but plants whispered to have other uses. You lean closer and hear names passed along. Rue, the herb of grace, said to weaken fertility. Fennel, crushed into teas. And pennyroyal, a minty green leaf that doctors of the time warned against, but women used anyway. A mainstream historical fact slides into view. In many surviving medieval herbal manuscripts, rue is specifically listed as a plant that cleanses the womb. Scholars argue whether that phrase meant contraception, abortion, or simply easing menstrual flow, but the ambiguity was intentional. A coded message hidden in plain sight. Your nose wrinkles at the bitter scent of pennyroyal as a woman crushes it between her fingers. She doesn't announce what she's doing. She hides it, glancing at the church steeple looming at the edge of the village. You realize that every herb in her basket is both medicine and rebellion. Quirky detail? Some women believed if you wore a garland of these herbs around your neck while dancing, it would keep conception away. Imagine explaining that to a medieval priest. No, father, it's not for fun, it's for health. The sun lowers, throwing long shadows, and you follow her inside her one-room cottage. The air is thick with smoke from the hearth. A pot simmers. Steam clings to the rafters. She stirs leaves and mutters half prayer, half incantation. You notice how she covers the pot when a neighbor knocks, sharing bread, but not sharing this recipe. Secrecy was survival. You can't help but smile. The medieval version of clear your browser history was literally don't leave the herbs on the table, but the risks hung heavy. Too much pennyroyal could poison. Too little rue would fail. Historians still argue whether women knew the exact dosages or simply gambled with what they had. You picture two midwives debating like modern scientists, but without lab coats, just shawls, mud on their shoes, and centuries of whispered trial and error. You step back out into the garden, night falling. The air is damp, frogs croak in the ditch, and stars poke through. Above, the moon slices the sky, and you sense the tension. Women look to nature for control, but nature didn't always listen. And so, Each herb plucked carried both hope and dread. A joke drifts in as you think of it. Medieval gardens were basically multi-purpose pharmacies. Spices for dinner, teas for fevers, and if you were unlucky, oops, that was supposed to stop babies, not stop you. Another chuckle escapes as you realize these women had no FDA-approved stamp, just gossip and gut instinct. And the final laugh tonight? The best contraceptive of the Middle Ages was often the husband's absence. War, trade, or plague did the job faster than any herb. Still, as the crickets chirp and the cottages fall quiet, you feel the weight of those secret gardens. Knowledge that could change a life. Knowledge that could end it. And every leaf, root, and seed you've seen here tonight is just the first step in a long and tangled journey through medieval attempts at birth control. You walk further along the muddy lane, the smell of smoke and manure clinging to the damp night air. A few cottages glow faintly with candlelight, their shutters pulled tight, as though they're hiding secrets you're not meant to see. You follow the sound of whispered laughter and step inside a room where two women sit at a rough-hewn table. Between them rests a clay bowl filled with honey, vinegar, and herbs that give off a sharp tang. You realize you've stumbled into another layer of medieval contraceptive practice. Mixtures that sound more like a bad salad dressing than medicine. One of the women dips a rag into the concoction and wrings it out with practiced care. She explains in hushed tones that honey could seal the womb, while vinegar might burn the seed. Of course, no medieval man wanted to picture his efforts literally drowned in salad marinade, but women clung to the belief that these mixtures worked, sometimes with remarkable conviction. Here's the mainstream historical fact for this part of your journey. Medical texts from as early as the 12th century describe intravaginal douches of vinegar, wine, or honey as ways to prevent conception. Did they work? Historians still argue whether the acidity truly affected sperm, or whether the real effect was psychological comfort in a world where options were few. You lean closer, the sweetness of honey mingling with the sour bite of vinegar until your nose twitches. It's a strange cocktail, half kitchen staple, half survival strategy. And here comes a quirky tidbit. Some women believed that if you applied honey, it would not only stop pregnancy, but also make intimacy more pleasurable. Picture that sales pitch in a medieval market. Keeps babies away and keeps your husband happy. 2 for 1. The second woman chuckles as she stirs, though her eyes dart nervously to the door. Everything about this ritual carries the weight of danger. If a priest walked in, he'd condemn them both for meddling in divine will. If the mixture failed, they risked scandal, poverty, or worse. Yet they continue, because silence isn't the same as acceptance. The bowl scrapes empty, and they tuck the cloth away in a small wooden chest lined with linen. You notice how carefully they hide it, just as you might hide your guilty snacks at the back of a cupboard today. Knowledge was precious, but so was secrecy. You can't help but joke to yourself. If medieval kitchens doubled as laboratories, no wonder some stews tasted suspicious. Imagine sitting down to dinner and asking, "Wait, is this the contraception soup or the normal one?" You'd better hope they labeled the jars. Another light laugh escapes. The first true family planning was probably just making sure your husband didn't find the vinegar bowl. Still, underneath the humor, you sense the seriousness. These mixtures weren't recipes from a cookbook, but desperate attempts to carve control out of an uncontrollable life. The very same honey that glazed a festive loaf of bread might also represent a woman's attempt to decide when or if she'd become a mother. The scholarly debate continues in your head as you step back into the cool night. Some historians insist that these methods were more symbolic than effective, serving as ritual reassurance rather than real contraception. Others argue the acidity in vinegar or the viscosity of honey could indeed create a barrier. The truth likely lies between a blend of science, superstition, and survival. You walk past a row of barrels stacked against the wall of an inn, the scent of wine rising from their seams. It reminds you of another variation, wine douches, recorded in manuscripts, thought to purify the womb. Again, you shiver at the thought, and another joke surfaces. Imagine explaining to your husband why all the wine went missing. Sorry, dear, it wasn't for drinking, it was for research. Above you, the sky spreads wide and dark, the stars flickering as if they too are keeping secrets. You realize every household, every garden, every kitchen may have carried some version of these remedies. They weren't just whispers, they were woven into the fabric of daily life, as common as bread and salt, and just as essential for those who wish to bend fate. By now, you feel the tug of sleep in your own body, but you lean against the cool wooden wall and let your imagination linger. Honey, vinegar, wine, all simple things, yet wielded like weapons in a quiet war against inevitability. And you can't help but think, maybe the true ingredient wasn't sweetness or sourness, but courage. You wake with the faint crowing of a rooster, the village wrapped in a mist that clings to the fields like an old cloak. As you walk down the rutted path, you see a young couple hurrying past, their heads bowed, glancing nervously at the chapel's spire. You overhear a whispered fragment, "Not tonight, wait for the right days." And suddenly, you realize you're brushing against one of the oldest and riskiest methods of medieval contraception, the rhythm of time itself, the so-called safe days, though no one back then would have dared to call them scientific. You see, long before ovulation kits or fertility apps, people relied on guesswork tied to the moon, the tides, and sometimes sheer hope. Women kept rough calendars on scraps of parchment, carving notches into sticks, or marking with chalk near the hearth. They watched their monthly bleed with the intensity of astronomers charting stars. Some believed avoiding intimacy just before and after menstruation was safest. Others insisted those very days were the fertile ones. Historians still argue whether these ideas stemmed from Aristotle's musings, Galen's writings, or just neighborly gossip passed down like a poorly translated recipe. The mainstream fact comes clear. There were treatises circulating in monasteries and universities that discussed female cycles. One Latin text even hinted that conception was less likely if intercourse happened outside the mid-month, though nobody could quite pin down what mid-month meant without a proper calendar. And here's the kicker. The church never officially endorsed rhythm, but many priests quietly advised couples that restraint was holier than endless babies they couldn't feed. You watch that young couple duck behind a barn, clearly deciding to gamble on timing instead of herbs or potions. The air is thick with hay and animal musk, and you can't help but think of the absurdity. Two humans trying to outsmart biology with nothing more than shadows and lunar cycles. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval folks believed that if a woman conceived while the moon was waning, the child would be weak. But if conceived on a waxing moon, the child would be strong. So yes, some couples not only avoided certain nights, but also scheduled passion, according to astronomy. Imagine whispering, "Sorry, dear, Mars is in retrograde. We'd better not risk it." The medieval version of "Not tonight, honey." The risk, of course, was enormous. Many children were conceived despite these attempts, and villagers joked grimly that God laughs at calendars. You picture women erasing their chalk marks with a frustrated sigh, muttering about how the stars betrayed them. And there's your first joke. If you think modern dating apps are unreliable, try trusting your entire reproductive future to the phases of the moon. The scholarly debates hum in the background as you walk past the fields. Was this rhythm method a genuine attempt at control, or just a way of feeling less helpless? Some scholars argue women took it seriously, crafting entire ritual patterns around it. Others claim it was little more than superstition dressed in pseudo-logic. Whatever the case, it shows you how even the simplest acts, tracking the moon, counting days, were wielded as fragile shields against fate. You wander into a cottage where an older woman sits by the fire, her hands rough from years of spinning wool. She pulls out a wooden tally stick, each groove a month, each notch a cycle. She tells her daughter to wait 7 clean days before lying with her husband. The young girl nods, her face pale, clearly unsure, but too afraid to question. You see the generational weight here. Knowledge handed down like heirlooms, fragile but trusted. You chuckle softly at another modern parallel. In a way, these women were the first users of a tracking app. Only their version didn't send annoying notifications. It just sat by the hearth until someone remembered. And the second joke sneaks in. If a medieval husband asked why his wife was avoiding him, she could just point to the moon and shrug. Sorry, the universe says no. The night returns quickly, and you find yourself gazing upward. The moon glows bright, casting silver on the rooftops. You realize this luminous disk, so romantic to poets and lovers, was also a silent participant in countless anxious calculations. Each phase a promise or a threat. You feel both awe and pity, knowing how fragile their system was. And here comes the third laugh of the night. In truth, the best rhythm method of the Middle Ages wasn't counting days. It was when the husband got drunk and fell asleep before trying anything. Accidentally effective, if not intentional. You walk away from the couple's cottage, the mist curling around your ankles, the sound of crickets rising. Your mind lingers on the fragile hope these people clung to, that by scratching lines on wood or watching the moon, they could bend the future. But deep down, you sense what they knew too. Sometimes fate writes over your notches, and the child comes anyway. You step off the rutted lane into the market square, just as the sun burns away the last of the mist. Stalls bloom with wool, onions, salted fish, and dented pewter, yet your eye keeps catching the small, secret things. Pouches tied to belts, cords knotted beneath bodices, little bundles stitched into hems. When the wind shifts, you hear them click softly. Bone against bead, tooth against tin. You realize you're staring at a quieter branch of medieval contraception. Talismans cut from animals, carried close to the skin, as if the borrowed life force might guard the threshold of the womb. A girl at a stall fingers a leather thong from which dangles something pale and curved. She notices you watching and tucks it back, but not before you glimpse a fox tooth polished by worry and time. Her mother changes the subject to onions with the universal gesture of not for the street. Yet the meaning lingers anyway, where the creature's cunning confuse fate. Your mainstream historical fact arrives with a gentle scrape of parchment. In the cluster of texts known as the Trotula, medieval writings on women's medicine from Salerno, amulets do appear among remedies for managing fertility and childbirth. A few instructions advise tying specific animal parts to a woman's thigh, or laying them near the bed to restrain conception or speed the child's path. The wording hedges just enough to be defensible in church, yet useful at home. That careful, medieval dance between prudence and piety. You drift past a cooper's bench, where shavings curl like pale ribbons. A midwife in a faded blue kirtle sits nearby, sewing a tiny pouch. She drops in a hare's foot, lighter than you'd expect, and a pinch of rue, then knots the pouch with 3 deliberate turns, as if numbers themselves could persuade the future. She murmurs that a hare, quick and prolific, might trick the body into either speed or stillness depending on how you wear it. Quirky tidbit for your pocket. In a few valleys, the pouch is buried beneath the threshold for one night first, so the house itself learns the spell. A skeptical breeze seems to pass through you. Historians still argue whether these animal charms were common practice or just the sort of colorful superstition that clerics copied down to scold. Records are patchy. Men wrote with disapproval. Women often could not write at all, but the appeal is obvious. A talisman requires no boiling pot, no precise dose. It only needs proximity, privacy, and the courage to pretend you have nudged the universe. Down by the stream, laundresses beat linen until the water turns to milk. Cords vanish beneath wet shifts. One slips and shows a tiny leather bean. The midwife whispers that it is a weasel's testicle, tied high on the thigh by night if you wish the womb to rest. You swallow. The object looks both ordinary and impossible, like a coin from a kingdom you hope never to visit. The jokes come softly because the afternoon is kind. First, imagine a medieval, everyday carry. Knife, flint, keys, and, oh yes, a discreet weasel part. Practical, if spectacularly conversation-stopping. Second, picture trying to explain this to airport security. Anything to declare? Just my anti-baby ferret accessory. Third, the fashion forecast. Subtle amulet chic. If your charm clicks when you walk, you're on trend. You watch how talisman logic maps onto clothing. Charms hide in boots, nestle in the pocket between chemise and gown, or sew neatly into linings. Some women pin a tiny hoof to the mattress tick, because the bed is the accomplice in this enterprise. A carpenter boasts that a headboard he carved with a stag motif once scared away the seed. You nod politely. Whether or not it worked, the craft is beautiful. At the far end of the square, a monk preaches against bestial relics, his voice thin in the wind. Most people drift on, Sermons are plentiful. Pouches are personal. The town lives in that familiar medieval harmony of contradiction. Official doctrine on one stave, daily survival humming a counter melody. The scholarly tug of war continues. Some argue these amulets extend sympathetic magic, borrow the swiftness of the hare, the cunning of the fox, the relentless fertility of the weasel, then redirect it, cap it, steer it. Others insist the practice was marginal, a clerical caricature inflated into rumor. You suspect the truth sits, as usual, in the muddied middle, common enough to be remembered, secret enough to be deniable. You trail the midwife to a chalk-white cottage. A young wife waits by the hearth, pale as the milk in her cup. The midwife lays out bone slivers and beads, asks whether the husband will be away with the cart this month. The wife nods, grain to the next town, gone 2 weeks, and relief crosses her face like a moth's shadow. The midwife chooses a fox tooth and a twist of red thread, the color of blood and warning. She tells the wife to tuck it in the left stocking and to avoid stepping over ropes or rakes, because tangles invite tangled luck. The wife smiles at the logic even as her hands tremble. You breathe the cottage smell, yeast, wood smoke, wet wool, and hear the quiet instruction to tap the pouch 3 times when the husband returns. Not because tapping changes chemistry, but because ritual steadies the heart. A steady heart sleeps. Sleep softens fear, and fear is the enemy of every plan. For balance, your mainstream fact returns with a coda. More than one remedy collection sets these amulets beside practical advice on rest, diet, and warmth. Medieval medicine wasn't a choice between reason and magic. It braided them, the way a sound cord holds because hemp alone would fray. Another odd note drifts from a gossiping neighbor. In one hamlet, women touched the ox's horn at each new moon, believing the crescent curve mirrored the sky's own shield against conception. You picture the line of embarrassed hands on a patient ox and try not to laugh. The scene is tender in its way. Community, superstition, and livestock united in a tiny ceremony of hope. Evening leans in, blue and cool. The square empties, shutters close, and the subtle clicking of hidden charms becomes the night's metronome. You walk the lane with that sound in your ears and a new understanding in your chest. Sometimes control is a pouch, a stitch, a secret you can wear. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. Historians may bicker forever, but tonight, a woman knots a cord, pats her skirt, and lets herself believe that the door is locked and the house is safe. The night has settled deep and cool, and you follow the flicker of a lantern down a back lane. The smell of damp stone and rosemary clings to the air. You duck into a small cottage where shadows dance across the walls. A woman with streaks of gray in her hair bends over a low table, grinding roots with a pestle. Her lips move in a rhythm that sounds half like a prayer, half like a warning. You've stumbled into the hidden world of potions, liquids brewed in secrecy, bitter as regret, and sometimes just as dangerous. The bowl before her contains mashed juniper berries, rue leaves, and a pinch of crushed cedar resin. She pours a ladle of wine to bind it all together. The steam rises in sharp waves, stinging your nose until your eyes water. You realize this isn't dinner. This is medicine with an agenda, to change what the body might do next. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Medieval texts often mention herbal drinks prepared specifically for cleansing the womb or regulating the monthly flow. Whether those phrases meant abortifacients, contraceptives, or simply treatments for irregular cycles remains debated. Historians still argue whether recipes preserved in monastic manuscripts were copied for study, or whether monks themselves quietly collected knowledge from local women. Either way, these brews existed, hidden between the lines of respectable medicine. The woman stirs, slowly, humming. You notice how carefully she measures the drops, as though one too many could flip the remedy into poison. Quirky tidbit? Some records mention women carrying these potions in hollowed-out goose bones sealed with wax. Portable doses for the desperate. You can almost imagine a medieval handbag rattling with bone tubes, each one a gamble. The taste, when the young wife she's brewing for takes a sip, is unmistakably vile. Her face contorts, but she swallows bravely, clutching her belly afterward with a look that's half hope, half dread. The hearth crackles, but you can feel the weight pressing heavier than the smoke. She has no certainty, only faith in bitter liquid. A joke slides in quietly, because even tension needs a release. First you think, if medieval Yelp existed, every potion would get 1 star. Tastes awful, may or may not work, would not recommend, but have no choice. Second, imagine explaining to a husband why the expensive wine is gone. Oh, don't worry, dear. It's in my medicine. Third, if modern bartenders worked like medieval potioners, the cocktail menu would read, side effects may include dizziness, nausea, and existential dread. You watch as the healer wipes the bowl with rough linen, then sprinkles ashes over the fire to hide the smell. Secrecy is half the recipe. She warns the young wife not to speak of it outside these walls, not to neighbors, not even to her sister. The woman nods, her lips pale. You sense that the silence itself is part of the brew, binding the effect together. Outside, the village seems oblivious. Men drink at the tavern, children chase each other barefoot, and the church bell tolls the hour. Yet within cottages like this one, night after night, such potions simmered quietly, away from prying eyes. The tension between public piety and private survival hums like a string pulled too tight. Historians debate again in your ear. Were these concoctions medical, magical, or both? Some argue that women genuinely believed in their physiological effect, citing the strong herbs involved. Others suggest the act of brewing, the chanting, the secrecy, worked more as psychological reassurance. The truth, like the smoke from the hearth, twists between both explanations. You step out into the crisp air, the stars sharp overhead. A dog barks in the distance, its voice echoing across the empty fields. You can still taste bitterness at the back of your throat, as though the potion's steam clings to you. The woman behind the door lies down, hoping the brew will grant her control over her future. Whether it works or not, she'll never tell you directly. But her silence, her secrecy, is its own answer. And you realize something unsettling. In a world with no pills, no clinics, and no safety nets, the bitter brew was both weapon and gamble. Every sip was a coin tossed into the dark, hoping it would land on the side that meant freedom. The sun rises pale, filtered through clouds like old parchment. You follow the sound of bells toward the village church, its stone walls damp with moss. A cluster of women kneel near the entrance, fingers brushing strings of beads and wooden crosses. Their lips murmur prayers, yet tucked beneath their shawls are small amulets blessed by priests, objects believed to carry the power not just to heal souls, but also to shield wombs. You pause at the threshold. A priest in brown robes lifts a charm, a tiny carved piece of bone, and blesses it with a hurried sign of the cross. He mutters Latin words too fast for you to follow. Then he presses it into a woman's palm with a stern look that says, "This is for faith, not for mischief." But she slips it beneath her bodice with practiced ease, and you can almost hear her silent thought. Faith and mischief are not always enemies. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Christian Europe of the Middle Ages was filled with relics, amulets, and blessed objects. While most were intended for protection against illness, demons, or bad luck, some records show women believed these charms could prevent or end pregnancy. Historians still argue whether priests truly endorsed this use or merely looked away. But the fact remains. Holy objects weren't always limited to holy purposes. You walk inside, inhaling the sharp scent of incense. Candles sputter along the altar, dripping wax like slow tears. A woman kneels nearby, pressing a small medal to her lips. She whispers that Saint Margaret, patroness of childbirth, will grant her mercy, not a safe delivery, but no delivery at all. The irony curls in the air. Saints meant to bless birth were sometimes asked to prevent it. Quirky tidbit? In some villages, women believed carrying a parchment inscribed with a psalm tied around the waist would close the womb. Imagine tucking scripture into your underwear drawer. Sacred words moonlighting as contraception. You can't help but smile at the absurd overlaps. First joke. The medieval slogan could have been, "Got miracles? Try St. Margaret's limited time protection plan." Second, imagine confession. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," by using your prayer scroll as birth control. Third, you picture a medieval infomercial. For just 3 Ave Marias a night, you too can enjoy worry-free evenings. The church itself hums with contradictions. Priests preached abstinence as the safest path, yet some quietly blessed objects women whispered over. Relics meant to heal bodies doubled as barriers to conception. Historians still debate whether this was tolerated out of compassion or ignorance, or whether priests themselves knew exactly what they were enabling. Outside, the women gather by the churchyard wall. One shows her friend a string of knots tied into a rosary, each knot a night of abstinence or protection. Another boasts of a charm her priest once pressed into her hand during confession. They laugh nervously, adjusting their shawls when a monk walks past. The blend of faith, fear, and defiance is thick enough to taste. You wander past gravestones softened by moss, and the village bell tolls again. The sky above is heavy with gray, and the air carries a damp chill. The stones around you seem to whisper that life here is never simple. Rules say one thing, desperation says another. And so women stitched faith into their strategies, whether by blessing, chant, or charm. As evening comes, you watch a young bride press her amulet beneath her pillow. She kisses her rosary and whispers to the dark, "Keep me safe." Whether she means safe from sin, safe from pregnancy, or both, you cannot say. But the sincerity in her voice feels ancient and immediate all at once. And here you see the paradox clearly. For medieval women, holy objects were not only shields for the soul, but shields for the body, even if the church insisted otherwise. In that soft candlelight, faith became medicine, and medicine became faith. You follow the fugitive smell before you see the room. Sharp, resinous, and faintly barnyard, as if a pine tree moved in with a goat. Inside, a low fire coaxes a copper pan to glimmer. A woman in a soot-dark kirtle stirs what looks like melted beeswax and tallow. Into that glossy pool she sprinkles powders from carefully labeled crocks, pomegranate rind, oak galls, and a pinch of alum that flashes like frost. You edge closer and the heat strokes your cheeks. Even the air feels oily. A thin film that seems to coat the inside of your nose. She glances up, makes space at the table, and nods to the empty stool like a quiet invitation into a very old craft. She works with the steadiness of a baker who weighs flour by the feel of the scoop. The beeswax thickens the base, she whispers, so the paste will hold its shape. The oil carries the herbs where they need to go. The galls and the alum, good astringents, tighten tender tissue. Her euphemisms are as tidy as hems. You remember the vinegar bowl from last night and the foxtooth pouch in the market. This is the same stubborn wish, only warmed over coals and folded into wool. She taps a wool tuft on the rim, tests the stickiness with her fingertip, and nods as if the paste has answered correctly. Here's your mainstream historical fact, set gently on the table. In medieval gynecological compilations, especially the texts later gathered under the name Trotula, you can find instructions for pessaries and unguents meant to close or bind the womb, often using wool smeared with resinous or astringent compounds such as myrrh, mastic, pomegranate rind, oak galls, or alum. Whether that wording signals contraception, treatment for prolapse, or general womanly regulation, the recipes exist, ink on vellum and thumb worn from use. They sit beside advice on diet, rest, and moderation, as if the body were a household that could be tidied with the right broom. She lifts a second crock, asafoetida, the devil's dung, and your eyes sting at the lid's first tilt. A crumb falls into the pan, and the room changes personality at once. If smell were a hired guard, this would be a bouncer with crossed arms. Quirky tidbit for tonight. Some midwives swore that a hint of asafoetida in a salve discouraged conception, and incidentally, discouraged husbands. 2 outcomes for the price of 1. She smiles without apology and feeds the fire a tiny branch of rosemary, not for flavor, but to bless the work and smoke over the smell. She lets the mixture cool until it gels like amber honey, then folds a twist of combed wool into it, shaping a small, soft pessary with quick, private hands. The instructions are careful and memorized. Warm it by the hearth just until pliant, never to dripping. Place briefly, remove before soreness. Never sleep the whole night with it. She speaks as if reading a prayer. The young wife who has come for help nods along, cheeks wind bright. Wedding ring new enough to shine in the dim. Fear and resolve hold equal weight in her face, and you can feel the room tip toward compassion. Scholarly debate curls through the steam like a question mark. Historians still argue whether these ointments had any genuine spermicidal action, or whether their main effect was simply mechanical. a tidy barrier fashioned from wool and wax, scented with confidence. Some point to the tannins in oak galls and pomegranate rind, to alum's astringency, to resins that alter moisture and pH. Others counter that dosage, timing, and preparation were too imprecise to matter. The documents don't settle the quarrel. The women did, one bedside experiment at a time, and they seldom wrote down the results. You crouch by the bench, where the crocks line up like a small apothecary choir. One bears a faded mark, galbanum, another myrrh. She says resins calm the flesh, tame swelling, perfume the worry. Some women prefer goose fat for the base, others olive oil stiffened with wax. Still others, a paste of ground ivy and lard. Methods travel with merchants and with marriages, changing accent as they cross mountains. A salve from Genoa will not smell like one from York, but each carries the same promise, that a door can be made to close for a night. That choice can be built out of ordinary things. Because the night leans heavy, you let a joke out to breathe. First, if medieval product labels existed, this one would read, now with extra stick, removes from linens, eventually. Second, imagine the fragrance notes. Top, pine and chapel smoke. Heart, herbal apothecary. Base, faint barnyard. Pairs well with candlelight and plausible deniability. Third, a tiny warning in crabbed script. May also repel wolves, suitors, and most dinner guests. The midwife huffs a laugh. The young wife actually smiles, and for a second the room smells less like tar and more like relief. Over in the corner, a scrap of parchment waits, edges singed where the lamp kissed it. The notes are maddeningly vague. Take of rind of the apple of Persia, of galls, of alum, of mastic, grind, mingle with oil, make pessary of wool. Use before the work of love, remove after. No measures, no certainty, only verbs. You sigh at the medieval habit of treating dosage like a family secret. Who could afford resins from far ports? Who had beeswax in winter? Who knew the difference between a crumb and a pinch? Control hid in cupboards and in words. Technique was a kind of property. The young wife thanks her in a whisper that doesn't quite find the floor. The midwife caps the crocks one by one and presses her palm to the cooling pan, reading the temperature the way a shepherd reads weather. If it pulls like taffy, it's ready. If it runs, it lies, she says, more to herself than to you. Before you leave, she gives you the smallest smile. There are doors, she says softly, and there are ways to mind them. You nod, even though part of you aches at how often those doors still refuse to latch. Another note for your pocket. Some recipes advise adding a breath of wine lees or a touch of vinegar to the salve, claiming the acidity weakens the seed. Whether that is physiology or poetry, you cannot say with certainty. But the logic hangs together like a good braid. Oil to carry, wax to hold, wool to place, astringents to tighten, fragrance to buy a moment's peace from a crowded world. You think of the honey and vinegar from the kitchen, of the amulets blessed at the church door, of the fox tooth stitched into a hem. Different pathways, one destination, a night of chosen quiet. Outside, the lane hushes under frost. The moon lifts a rim of cold light on every roof tile. The smell of resin clings to your hair, and the stars seem simpler than recipes. Small, distant, burning, without needing pomegranate or alum. Somewhere a dog shakes off sleep, the chain whispering against a post. You walk back through the cold, and you know the women behind these walls will keep stirring, measuring, and hoping. Because hope is the oldest ingredient, and it is always in stock. The frost still bites your cheeks as dawn slips into the village, and you hear the muffled thud of looms and the bleat of goats. But what draws your eye this morning isn't the clamor of work. It's the quiet movements of women carrying baskets lined with wool. Not yarn, not spun cloth, but soft tufts of raw fleece pulled straight from the sheep, fluffed and ready for something far more private than weaving. You realize you've walked into the world of pessaries made from wool and herbs, an everyday material turned into a secret defense. You crouch beside one woman as she kneads the wool between her palms, softening it until it looks like a little cloud. She dips it into a mixture of olive oil and crushed mint leaves, twisting it gently until the green streaks vanish into the fibers. Then, with a solemn nod, she tucks it into a wooden box beside her hearth. The act is so ordinary, no chanting, no smoke, yet the weight of its intention makes the air hum. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Medical texts from Salerno and later compilations, including the Trotula, describe the use of wool soaked in herbal mixtures or oils as a pessary, intended to either cool the womb or repel conception. The wool acted as both carrier and barrier, flexible enough to shape and discreet enough to remove. Historians still argue whether this was true contraception, treatment for gynecological ailments, or a blend of both. Quirky tidbit: some midwives swore by adding salt to the oil, believing the sharpness would dry the seed. You can almost hear the sales pitch. Now with extra seasoning, birth control, and dinner spice in one handy bundle. You follow another woman into her cottage, where she warms the fleece near the fire before dipping it into melted beeswax mixed with rue. The wax stiffens the wool just enough to keep its shape. She presses it into a rounded plug, whispers a short prayer, and sets it on a cloth to cool. The smell is faintly sweet, faintly bitter, like honey laced with regret. Your mind flicks to a modern comparison, and here's the first joke. If medieval women had a product catalog, this would be the Wool 2.0, now with herbal freshness. Second laugh. Picture a husband rummaging through the wool box looking for thread and finding these little herbal clouds instead. Darling, why does this yarn smell like vinegar? Third chuckle. If Etsy had existed, medieval pessaries would have been the best sellers, handmade with love and rue, shipped discreetly. But beneath the humor, you feel the stakes. These weren't whimsical crafts. They were survival kits. The wool was free, the herbs grew at hand, and the midwife's whispered advice made it all seem possible. The young wives treated these pessaries like talismans, inserting them with quiet hope, removing them with nervous relief. Some probably worked. Wool with wax or resin could create a real barrier, but many must have failed. And yet, failure didn't erase faith. It only deepened the secrecy. Historians debate endlessly. Were these pessaries genuinely effective? Or were they rituals of reassurance in a world with few options? Some argue that herbal oils like pennyroyal or rue might have had mild spermicidal properties, while others point out the dangers of toxicity. A single wrong dose could turn protection into poison. The truth as usual, is tangled. A woolen thread knotted between faith, science, and desperation. You leave the cottage and walk down the lane. A girl, no older than 16, balances a basket on her hip. Inside are tufts of wool and sprigs of thyme. She smiles shyly when you glance, then quickens her pace as if caught. You realize how young, how unprepared so many women were, and how these little woolen plugs represented not just control, but a tiny claim to adulthood. The air grows colder, the frost crunching under your boots. In the distance, a shepherd whistles to his flock. You imagine the irony. Sheep providing not only food and clothing, but also this hidden kind of protection. Every bleat sounds almost like a reminder. Wool for warmth, wool for safety. As night falls again, you see a midwife tucking a woolen pessary into a linen pouch for her patient. She whispers that the moon is waxing, that tonight is risky, that tomorrow will be safer. The young woman nods, clutching the pouch like a holy relic. In her eyes, you see both fear and fierce resolve. And you realize that in these tiny tufts of wool lies an entire philosophy. When the world won't give you choices, you make them yourself, one quiet bundle at a time. The wind sharpens as you climb the slope beyond the village, where dung heaps steam faintly against the chill. You wrinkle your nose, already half aware of what waits here, a practice so bizarre it has survived as a legend, yet one with ink stains of truth in ancient and medieval manuscripts. Tonight you step into the unsettling world of contraceptives made of crocodile dung, ashes, and whatever else desperation could press into service. A woman in a patched cloak crouches at the edge of the yard, poking through a pile of ash with a flat stick. She gathers the fine gray powder into a small clay jar. Inside the cottage, she mixes it with honey until it clumps, then pats it into little plugs. The smell is acrid sweet, like burnt bread dipped in syrup. She sets them near the hearth to harden while her daughter looks away, pretending not to know. You watch in silence, half appalled, half fascinated. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Recipes involving animal dung as contraceptives appear not only in ancient Egyptian papyri, but also echoed faintly in medieval lore. While crocodiles were obviously scarce in Europe, translations of classical texts carried these ideas into the Middle Ages. Historians still argue whether European women ever actually attempted the practice, or whether it lingered as a cautionary tale, proof that desperation knows no boundaries. Quirky tidbit: some households substituted pigeon droppings, goat dung, or even ashes of burnt linen when crocodile waste was unavailable. Imagine scribbling that substitution note in a recipe book. Out of crocodile, try pigeon. A kind of grim medieval version of kitchen hacks. The woman molds another plug and wraps it in cloth, muttering that what is foul keeps away what is unwanted. The phrase lands heavy, a belief that foulness itself could guard the womb. You shiver as you consider the crude logic. And here come the jokes, because your nose needs relief. First, if candle making and contraception shared ingredients, that's one way to explain why the candles smelled so questionable. Second, imagine a medieval sales pitch. Guaranteed protection and guaranteed to keep your partner at least an arm's length away. Third, you can't help but think dung-based birth control was the medieval version of ghosting, because who'd want to come close after that? The scholarly debate hums in your ear. Some argue these recipes were symbolic, not practical. Rituals meant to discourage intimacy rather than physically block conception. Others believe the alkaline properties of ashes and the thick paste of dung could, in theory, alter vaginal pH enough to hinder sperm. The truth, likely a messy mix of folklore, fragments of ancient medicine, and sheer hope that repulsion equaled prevention. As night deepens, you wander into a smoky hall where men drink ale, laughing and boasting. Outside, women gather near the fire pit, whispering and passing jars under their cloaks. You see one slip her jar of ash honey paste into a pouch with the same reverence another might give to a saint's medal. The contrast is striking. Loud songs within, quiet survival without. The stars glitter mercilessly above, and you realize the depth of desperation behind such practices. To risk health, to endure shame, to rely on substances both foul and toxic. It wasn't ignorance so much as the absence of alternatives. You breathe through your sleeve to mask the stink, but you can't mask the truth. Even dung and ashes could become tools of agency when nothing else was at hand. The fire dies low, embers glowing red. The women slip back into their cottages, jars hidden, faces set. You stand alone, the stink fading on the wind, the stars cold and bright overhead. And in that silence, you understand. History isn't only what is noble or beautiful. Sometimes it's what is strange, desperate, and uncomfortable, and what women dared anyway. The morning light spills weakly over the village roofs, a pale yellow wash that does little to cut the chill. You pass men shouldering tools toward the fields, their boots sinking into mud with familiar resignation. But your attention lingers on quieter exchanges, men leaning too close to whisper, women glancing away with small smiles that carry both trust and doubt. Tonight's path leads you into the uncertain world of withdrawal, that age-old method dressed up as confidence, yet often undone by human error. In the corner of a barn, a young husband boasts to his friends that he knows how to control himself. They nod, slap his back, and pour him ale as though mastery of timing were proof of masculinity. You can almost hear the fragile bravado, a belief that self-restraint could substitute for herbs, charms, or wool. Of course, you suspect the women at home rolled their eyes so hard they nearly saw heaven. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Manuscripts from the Middle Ages, including translations of Galen and other classical physicians, mention withdrawal, coitus interruptus, as a practice known but morally contested. The Church condemned it outright, equating it with spilling seed and defying divine intent. Historians still argue whether its frequency matched its reputation, or whether it lingered more in scolding sermons than in daily practice. Quirky tidbit? In some regions, midwives joked that men trust their aim more than their fields, a sly dig at how farmers sow grain carefully but wasted no thought on their bodies sowing. It was both humor and warning. Passed among women like a sly wink, you crouch behind a half door, watching one couple argue in hushed tones. The wife insists the method fails too often, that she has no faith in his iron discipline. He counters that herbs taste foul, Charms feel foolish, and wool costs too much. The quarrel dissolves into silence, each knowing the other has no perfect answer. The gap between faith and risk yawns wide in the smoky air. You let a joke slip through the tension. First, medieval men probably invented the phrase, "Trust me," precisely for this moment. And it carried the same level of reliability then as now. Second, if husbands were graded like archers, withdrawal would earn them a lot of missed targets and sheepish apologies. Third, imagine the local priest overhearing. He'd need an extra sermon and maybe an extra glass of sacramental wine. The scholarly debate hums louder now. Some argue withdrawal was common, especially in urban households where families already strained against poverty. Others insist the stigma was so heavy, couples avoided admitting it even in confessions. And perhaps that's the truth. It happened often, but lived only in whispers, never in official ink. You walk along the lane, the air sharp with smoke from breakfast fires. A midwife leans against a wall, her arms folded. She mutters that women rarely trusted the method, but sometimes it was all they had when herbs ran short or money was thin. Her eyes are weary but kind, the eyes of someone who has seen too many promises turn into births 9 months later. Evening creeps again, settling over the cottages like a dark cloak. Behind shuttered windows, couples lie together, bargaining with timing, hoping faith and restraint will be enough. Some nights it works, other nights it doesn't. But the gamble repeats itself, season after season. And here's the truth that clings to you as the stars appear. Withdrawal in the Middle Ages was less a method than a mirror. It reflected trust, fear, desperation, and denial all at once. A fragile barrier built not of herbs or wool, but of promises easily broken. And in that fragile silence, you understand why women still reached for charms, potions, and prayers, because hope built on another's self-control was never quite enough. The church bell tolls, a hollow note that rolls over the thatch and settles in puddles like a coin dropped into dark water. You follow its echo to the squat stone chapel, where damp wax smokes beneath the rafters, and the iron latch complains as if piety were too heavy to lift. People wedge into pews, caps pulled low, hands tucked in sleeves, while you linger by the door and listen, because what shapes nights in this village is rarely the sermon itself. It is the whisper that follows when the amen thins away. The priest lifts the host and preaches in steady winter syllables. In his telling, the body is a plow, yoked to God's field. To tilt it otherwise is to break the furrow. No herbs, no clever devices, no interruption. Only continence when you must, and conception when you may. Men cough, children swing their legs, and the women's eyes drift inward, counting coins, counting loaves, counting nights they can spare. Clarity and comfort are cousins who seldom share a bed. The lesson lands hard and cold as frost. Here's your mainstream historical fact, set down as firmly as a psalter on a lectern. Throughout the Middle Ages, church councils, confession handbooks, and pastoral letters denounced contraception and praised abstinence as the sole permissible way to avoid conception. Guides for confessors listed forbidden times, Lent and Advent, the eves of major feasts, Sundays, sometimes even Wednesdays and Fridays, warned against relations during menstruation, and instructed abstinence after childbirth until churching restored a mother publicly to the parish. Whether every cottage obeyed was one story. The official music was another. Mass loosens with a squeal of hinges. Outside, people collect in eddies near the well. 3 women draw their shawls tight and talk with the frankness that follows duty. One says she keeps the fast whole, withholding herself through Lent with the same stubbornness she withholds butter. Another admits she coughs theatrically on risky nights, the sort of cough that suggests prayer and implies distance. A third smiles that her husband favors trade roads precisely when saints crowd the calendar, and everyone laughs, grateful that carts and saints sometimes pull in the same direction. Quirky tidbit for your pocket. Some households mapped intimacy so zealously to the liturgical year that the ledger of no nights seemed to outnumber the yeses. Advent off, the 12 days off, Lent off, eves of feasts off, Sundays off, Wednesdays and Fridays off, half a year stitched shut like a purse. Memory may exaggerate, but the village joke endures. If a husband wants certainty, he needs a saint's calendar more than a love poem, and maybe a mule to carry it home from market. You drift past the bakehouse, where steam ghosts the panes, and the smell of rye makes even fasting feel generous. A young couple argues in the lee of a wall. He quotes the homily as if it were a shield. She answers with the ledger. Another babe means selling the heifer, she says, pinching the frayed edge of her sleeve. They bargain toward peace. He will sleep in the loft for holiness, and she will leave a heel of cheese on the ladder for courage. You file the code. Loft means abstinence. Cheese means truce. Holiness and hunger have learned to share a table. Because nights need a smile, you deliver 3. First, if medieval couples had invented a relationship status, it would be, it's complicated. Consult parish calendar. Second, the most reliable contraceptive in some homes is the church bell. Nothing empties a mood like a call to matins. Third, if a wife truly longs for quiet, a heroic smear of garlic at supper can canonize the evening by smell alone. That is devotion by perfume. Even saints would step politely backward. By the smithy, sparks stitch bright accents into the gloom. The smith's wife shares what everyone knows, and no priest can quite forbid. Breastfeeding often spaces babies. Months of nursing soften fertility, milk buys time. She doesn't call it science. She calls it sleep. In a village that treats sleep like currency, her observation is worth more than a Latin paragraph. You nod and tuck it where you keep truths learned by bodies rather than by books. Back at the well, an elder midwife perches on the low wall, palms folded like folded linen. She reminds a young bride that after childbirth, the first laws are flesh and rest. Warm broth, a quiet room, and no husband until bleeding stills, and the ritual of churching welcomes her back among the pews. The bride reddens. The midwife is kind. Your bones are beams, she says. Let the house settle before you invite in thunder. In that line, abstinence becomes architecture, structure, safety, a roof against weather and worry. You walk the lane and feel how the calendar itself is a tool. Saints' days, vigils, fasts. These become polite barricades a woman can point to without open defiance. She does not say no to her husband. She says yes to St. Margaret, yes to Lent, Yes, to the rule everyone hears on Sunday. Behind that yes, a smaller no can rest without drawing fire. It is a delicate art, piety as shield, reverence as refuge. The debate that scholars love and villagers ignore rises like steam from warm stone. Historians still argue whether these prescriptions were top-down control or bottom-up cooperation. Did clerics impose calendars to govern bodies? Or did communities borrow holy language to negotiate rest? Your ear, tuned to kitchens and yards more than chancels, suspects a braid, some obedience, some resistance, and much practical compromise, stitched with the thinnest possible thread of conscience. A boy with mud to his knees chases a hen past your boots. His mother scolds him without looking up from her mending. She says, almost idly, that she and her husband keep apart during planting and harvest because sleep is seed. It isn't theology, it's logistics. Yet the phrase would sit comfortably beside a psalm. Rural life excels at plating the useful to the devout until they taste the same. And abstinence often wears that braided look, half prayer, half plan, half plain relief from aching backs. Because myths travel faster than bread, you nod to the noisy legend of iron chastity belts. You look around. No clanking girdles dangle from rafters. No padlocks gleam behind doors. That picture belongs mostly to later fantasies and joke cabinets. There may have been medical girdles and moral tales, but village reality deals in shawls, calendars, and carefully convenient coughs, not keys and locksmiths. Folklore loves iron. Daily life prefers linen, a fabric easier to negotiate and to wash. Afternoon fades, and the eaves gather a black thread of night. You watch a couple bank the fire and set 2 stools by the hearth. He reads haltingly from a psalter. She knits and pretends not to notice the mispronunciations. Between them lies a foot of space, thick as doctrine and soft as mercy. When the candles gutter, he climbs to the loft, each rung a small concession to the season. She counts to 100 because rules feel kinder with numbers, and breathes as if the room itself were a warm hand on her back. Not every home keeps the same rhythm. Down the lane, a husband returns belligerently devout after ale and argues that abstinence tonight will please Saint whoever. His wife, weary-eyed, meets piety with arithmetic. Bread low, shoes thin, back sore. She spreads her tools. Silence, the blanket turned edgewise, the claim of a vigil, the midwife's instructions. And the quarrel collapses into a truce made of turned shoulders and the slow forgiveness of sleep. You step away. Privacy is also a sacrament here. In your ear, the sermon reruns. And for once, you answer it aloud, gently. The church aims to shape souls. The village aims to survive. When those aims align for a season, everyone says amen. When they don't, the village shifts the line by an inch, calls the inch devotion, and keeps going. Hypocrisy or wisdom? In a world where winter returns annually and babies never arrive with extra loaves of bread, the question stays open like a window in a warm kitchen, letting steam and truth breathe together. At the chapel window, late light clings like honey. Inside, a visiting nun teaches children a hymn. Her voice is thin but steady. Their answers are ragged but earnest. You think how abstinence in the convent belongs to a different river entirely, vowed, total, sometimes serene and sometimes stormy. You bow from the lane, not in agreement, but in respect for any discipline kept in a world that frays everything. The nun smiles. The children sing louder for it, proud of the sound they make with borrowed Latin. A last sweep through the yard reminds you that abstinence is not always a kindness, not always chosen, not always fair. Yet even when it pinches, it can become a lever. A woman works with 2 fingers and a prayer. She needn't argue doctrine or dose herbs. She can point to the calendar and say, "Tonight, we wait." The waiting is not forever. It is a pause long enough for strength to return, for bread to rise, for fear to cool from a boil to a simmer. Before the hour closes, let the jokes return like sparrows to a beam. One more for luck. If feast days cut the marital calendar in half, the true medieval love language was scheduling. Another, the phrase, "I have a headache," is perennial. The upgrade here is, "I have a vigil." And a last, somewhere, a bored scribe doodles in a margin, a husband sulking while a haloed saint raises a stop hand, and he will call it an allegory when the abbot walks by to avoid penance. The stars climb to their posts. A fox yips beyond the hedgerow. The well-rope creaks, then settles. You wander home with the sense that abstinence, whatever else it is, sometimes gives a woman a door she can close without slamming. Found between saints' days and seasons, between loaves and losses, between the bell and the bed. In that space, a body rests. Resting itself becomes a form of care, a small rebellion wrapped in reverence, a breath saved for the work of tomorrow. So you close the door softly, the way women have done for centuries when they hope to steer a small part of tomorrow. You bank the coals, listen to the tiny ticks of cooling iron, and let the quiet do its old, holy work. The village breathes, the bell sleeps, and for tonight at least, the calendar holds. The frost that silvered the thatch has melted into mud by morning, and you find yourself trailing behind a group of women carrying baskets of bread to the market square. They gossip freely, their voices mingling with the clatter of hooves and the calls of traders. Yet when the conversation drifts from the price of flour to the mysteries of the moon, you notice their tone change. They lower their voices, glance at the church spire, and speak as though the very air might report them. You lean in and realize you're hearing the language of fertility myths, of cycles, stars, and lunar rhythms woven into daily life. At the center of the square, a woman unrolls a scrap of parchment marked with lines and circles, her version of a calendar. Each symbol marks nights to welcome passion or nights to shun it. She explains, half proud, half weary, that conception thrives at the waxing moon and falters at the waning. Her neighbor argues the reverse. Waning moon weakens the seed, waxing strengthens it. The two nearly laugh at the contradiction, yet both cling to their version, because hope is lighter when it wears the costume of reason. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Medieval physicians, influenced by ancient authorities like Aristotle and Galen, taught that timing conception around menstrual cycles and lunar phases mattered. Some manuals advised avoiding intercourse during menstruation or mid-month, while others connected fertility directly to moonlight. Historians still argue whether ordinary villagers followed such advice, or whether it remained theory in medical schools. But scraps of folklore suggest that women, even without literacy, tracked cycles by moon and season, finding patterns in the sky when books were forbidden. Quirky tidbit: in some regions, women hung polished bowls of water outside during a full moon, believing the reflection itself carried power to either invite or repel pregnancy, depending on how you whispered your wish. You imagine the absurdity: neighbors peering out windows, wondering why the yard suddenly glitters with bowls like a celestial soup kitchen. You walk on and find a shepherd's wife scratching lines into a tally stick. Each notch is a bleed, each groove a cycle. She mutters about counting clean days and tells her daughter to beware the seventh day after the flow, when seed is strongest. Her daughter nods, though her face betrays confusion. These rules shift like sand, yet they are carried forward because rules, however uncertain, are better than silence. You let humor creep in because it keeps the story from drowning. First, the medieval version of a period tracking app was literally a stick with scratches. No notifications, no pink icons, just splinters. Second, imagine the argument at home. Sorry, dear, the moon says no tonight. Which moon? My moon says yes. Third, if medieval villagers had horoscopes, they'd all read the same. Avoid passion tonight, unless you want an expensive surprise in 9 months. Yet beneath the jokes, you see genuine fear. Women kneel in the fields, lifting their eyes to the sky, asking whether the moon will betray them. A midwife, her hands cracked from cold, whispers that even the tides obey the moon. So why wouldn't the womb? It sounds logical enough when you're desperate for certainty. You watch her trace crescents in the dirt, explaining that the waxing moon pulls life forward, while the waning moon carries it away. Whether science or story, the pattern steadies the heart. The scholarly debate grows louder in your ear. Some historians argue that lunar and fertility links were more myth than medicine, grounded in symbolic associations rather than evidence. Others point to manuscripts where cycles and moon phases are charted side by side, suggesting at least some physicians took the connection seriously. The truth, as usual, is muddied, part science, part superstition, part survival. As dusk falls, you step into a cottage where a young wife lights a single tallow candle. She flips her tally stick and counts grooves, whispering under her breath. Her husband waits by the fire, patient but puzzled, until she nods slightly, and only then does he approach. You sense the fragile balance, desire negotiated through wood scratches and moonlight. And here's the irony: even when the rules failed, even when pregnancies came despite notches and moons, the practice endured. Because rituals comfort, even if they deceive. Because women needed to feel some measure of control, even if carved in wood and written in stars. You step back outside. The moon hangs above, pale and remote, unconcerned with human calculations. You think of all the women through centuries who stared at it, pleading, bargaining, trusting it to carry their secrets. You realize the moon has been a companion to both lovers and mathematicians, both poets and midwives, a celestial witness to countless whispered hopes. The village grows quiet. Crickets trill, dogs bark once and fall silent. You feel the sky stretch wide and old, and you understand. In the Middle Ages, fertility myths weren't silly distractions. They were survival tools, carved into sticks, drawn in dirt, sung in whispers under a waxing moon. Fragile, yes. Inaccurate, often. But they gave women something the church and medicine denied them. A sense that their bodies, their choices, could be read and understood if only they looked hard enough at the sky. The night comes on damp and heavy, with rain threading the air like silver wire. You follow the glow of a single hearth into a cottage that smells of smoke, herbs, and something sharp, like bitter tea steeped too long. On the rough-hewn table lies a clay cup, its rim stained dark, the liquid inside still steaming. A woman lifts it to her lips with a trembling hand. The way she swallows, slowly, carefully, tells you this isn't refreshment. This is ritual, gamble, and desperate hope, all brewed into one draft. Tonight, you've stepped into the hidden world of abortifacients cloaked as medicine. Teas that pretended to soothe, but carried heavier intent. The midwife stands nearby, eyes narrowed, hands folded in her apron. She says quietly, it is for her stomach. But the look she gives the younger woman says otherwise. Every cottage knows that rue, pennyroyal, tansy, and savin are no mere comforts. Brewed strong, they cleanse the womb. Brewed wrong, they kill the woman instead. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval herbals and medical texts list numerous plants under vague phrases like to bring on the menses or to cleanse the womb. These coded instructions often served as guides for abortifacients, though never admitted openly. Historians still argue whether the physicians who copied these recipes believed them to be contraception, abortion, or simply treatment for irregular periods. But the repetition across manuscripts, rue, pennyroyal, savin, suggests their use was far from accidental. The woman takes another sip and winces. Pennyroyal tastes minty, almost pleasant at first, but its strength lies hidden, waiting. You've read enough to know the danger. Too weak, and it does nothing. Too strong, and it poisons the liver. Yet here she drinks, because choice is worth risk, and silence is worth the gamble. Quirky tidbit? In some households, the potion wasn't drunk at all. It was boiled until thick, and then spread onto bread or sweet cakes to mask the bitterness. Imagine offering your guest a special tart without explaining the recipe. Hospitality and hazard baked into the same bite. You let yourself laugh softly because even desperation needs humor. First joke. If medieval Yelp existed, abortifacient teas would get reviews like 5 stars for results, 1 star for taste, overall, would drink again if I must. Second, imagine the awkward exchange if a husband unknowingly sipped the potion meant for his wife. Darling, why does this tea taste like weeds and regret? Third, if Starbucks existed in the 14th century, the secret menu would be truly scandalous. 1 pennyroyal latte, extra hot, hold the judgment. But when the laughter fades, you notice the lines of fear etched into the young woman's face. Her hands twitch as she sets down the cup, her lips whispering a prayer to St. Margaret. The irony burns. You can see the clash between church and body in every shiver of her shoulders. The midwife lays a hand on her back, offering comfort with silence, because here, words are too dangerous. The scholarly debate stirs louder in your ear. Some historians argue that women relied heavily on these teas, passing recipes from mother to daughter in whispers, a secret pharmacology of survival. Others claim the references in texts were symbolic, more about balancing humors than preventing children. The truth, you suspect, sits in the lived experience of countless women who brewed, drank, and hoped, whether the scribe approved or not. Or you wander outside, where the rain slicks the cobblestones. A group of women huddle beneath an awning, their baskets covered with cloth. One pulls out a bundle of tansy leaves, explaining in a low voice how to steep them just long enough to bring relief. Another shakes her head, warning that too much tansy kills quicker than it cures. Their debate is hushed, urgent, carried on like contraband. And you realize knowledge here is both shield and sword. It can save, but it can also cut. Back inside, the young wife curls on her pallet, her face pale, her breathing shallow. The midwife watches over her, not leaving even to stoke the fire. She hums softly, half lullaby, half prayer, as though sound itself might steady the body. You stand in the shadows and feel the weight of this moment. Medicine as rebellion, potion as plea, tea as lifeline. The hours stretch. Sometimes the draft works. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it brings relief. Sometimes it brings grief. And yet the practice survives, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation. Because silence does not mean ignorance. Women remembered what men's manuscripts tried to disguise. The rain eases, and dawn breaks gray. The young woman stirs, her breathing steadier, her eyes opening just enough to reveal both exhaustion and relief. She clasps the midwife's hand, whispers thanks, and closes her eyes again. Outside, the village stirs with ordinary life. Children laughing, dogs barking, men calling to one another. They'll never know what happened here, or they'll pretend not to. And that is how secrets survive. Because, here's the truth you cannot shake. In the Middle Ages, abortifacients weren't just medicine. They were quiet acts of resistance. Risks taken in kitchens and cottages. A way of seizing control in a world that offered none. The cups, the herbs, the whispered instructions. They were as much about courage as chemistry. And that courage, bitter and dangerous, brewed stronger than any tea. The rain has lifted, leaving behind puddles that reflect a gray, restless sky. Chickens peck at the softened ground, their feathers damp, while smoke rises lazily from the cottages, mingling with the scent of wet earth. You drift down a lane lined with crooked fences and hear a murmur, half laughter, half concern, coming from a cluster of women gathered around a fire pit. Their hands are busy with weaving, their tongues busy with stories. And tonight, those stories coil around an old danger. Love potions gone wrong. A young wife with flushed cheeks holds up a small clay vial, boasting that she bought it from a traveling peddler who promised it would keep her husband faithful, eager, but never fruitful. The women chuckle, but one shakes her head, muttering that such vials bring more grief than comfort. You lean closer, and the smell that escapes when the stopper is removed is sharp. Spiced wine turned sour, herbs bruised into bitterness. The liquid glimmers red in the firelight, almost alluring. Almost. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval Europe was filled with recipes for love potions, many preserved in grimoires and medical manuals. Some claimed to inspire passion, others to ensure fertility, and a few promised the opposite, to prevent conception or cool desire. Ingredients ranged from the common, honey, mint, wine, to the uncanny, ground bones, menstrual blood, animal organs. Historians still argue whether these potions were sincerely believed to work, or whether they were a mix of placebo, performance, and peril. One woman stirs the fire and recalls a neighbor who tried a potion made of mandrake root and nutmeg. Instead of preventing pregnancy, it sent her into fevers for 3 days. Another remembers a girl who slipped herbs into her lover's drink, only to watch him collapse with stomach cramps before they even touched. And then comes the silence, heavy and fearful, because they all know someone who risked too much for too little. Quirky tidbit: some medieval recipe books suggested adding powdered gemstones, sapphire or emerald, to the brew, claiming the noble stones would lend their purity to the body. Of course, powdered emerald is less a love charm than a fast track to a stomachache. Imagine sipping wine laced with ground jewelry, luxury and lunacy in a single swallow. You can't help but let humor rise because tension begs for laughter. First joke: medieval men boasting she's into me because of my charm might be correct, but the charm was literally in their drink. Picture the disaster if two women spiked the same man's ale on the same night. He'd wake up either immortal or very, very dead. Third, if medieval Tinder existed, the profile line would be, "Swipe right, but beware. I brew my own potions." The scholarly debate tugs at your sleeve. Some historians argue that love potions were more about performance than chemistry, a ritual that gave women psychological power in a world where they had little. Others insist that certain herbs, like rue or pennyroyal, could indeed affect fertility or libido, making these brews half science, half superstition. The truth likely lies in between, a fragile chemistry wrapped in hope and danger. You follow the young wife as she slips away from the fire, vial clutched in her hand. Inside her cottage, the hearth crackles. She pours the potion into a goblet of wine, stirring until the liquid darkens. Her husband, broad-shouldered and weary from labor, takes the cup without question. He drinks deeply, smacks his lips, and laughs that it tastes like bad tavern swill. She forces a smile, her eyes darting with nervous calculation. You feel the tension hang between them. Will it bring desire, or illness, or nothing at all? Hours later, the man stirs uneasily in his sleep, muttering, clutching his stomach. The woman lies awake, her face pale in the glow of the dying fire. You watch her regret bloom silently, because what she wanted was not this. She wanted passion without risk, closeness without consequence, control without poison. Instead, she has uncertainty, fear, and a vial nearly empty. Outside, the moon rises through torn clouds, pale and cold. You recall other tales whispered in the square, of women caught with potions and accused of witchcraft, of priests warning that love charms were the devil's work. One story speaks of a midwife burned out of her cottage for selling a brew that caused a nobleman's mistress to miscarry. Another tells of a young girl cast out by her family when her potion failed, her belly swelling despite all her efforts, because humor still insists on a place. You let another laugh slip. Imagine medieval courtroom evidence. Exhibit A, half a cup of weird wine. Or better yet, a husband declaring proudly, "My wife's cooking is so good, I get dizzy afterward," never realizing it was the roux in his stew. The line between dinner and disaster was sometimes thinner than a spoon, but when the laughter fades, the weight remains. These potions carried not just risk of poisoning, but risk of discovery. To be accused of witchcraft was to stand at the edge of ruin. A single vial could be evidence enough. A single rumor fuel for a pyre, and yet women still brewed them, still bought them from peddlers, still whispered recipes to daughters. Because the alternative, the relentless tide of pregnancies, the risk of death in childbirth, the endless hunger of too many mouths, felt more terrifying than any vial. You walk back to the fire pit, now just glowing embers. The women have gone inside, their laughter faded, their fears carried home in shawls and secrets. The village lies quiet under the watch of the moon. You realize that love potions were not really about love at all. They were about survival, about carving slivers of control in a world that offered almost none. The embers crackle once more, sending a spark into the dark. You watch it rise, flare, and fade. Just like the potions, just like the whispered promises, they glowed bright, dangerous, fleeting. And yet, they were tried again and again, because hope has always been stronger than fear, even when brewed in clay cups by uncertain hands. The morning breaks soft but restless. Mist hangs low, hugging the hedgerows like damp wool while roosters call from uneven yards. You step carefully along the muddy path leading away from the church bell, past the blacksmith's clang and the chatter of merchants setting up their stalls. But your destination isn't the square today. It lies at the village's edge, in a small cottage whose doorway is marked not by banners or saints, but by drying herbs strung in bundles. Rue, sage, wormwood, tansy, pennyroyal. Their stalks clink softly against one another in the breeze, like a secret language knocking at the wind. You know before you even step inside that this is no ordinary house. This is the midwife's cottage. The door creaks open. The scent of dried lavender tangles with sharper notes, savory, resinous, a little acrid. Inside, shelves sag under clay jars, wax-sealed bottles, and folded cloths. A low fire glows on the hearth, warming a pot whose steam swirls thick as breath. At the center of the room sits the midwife herself, gray hair tucked beneath a kerchief, her fingers deft and restless. She looks up with eyes that glint, not with suspicion, but with certainty. The kind of certainty born from decades of witnessing what others only whisper about. Two women sit on stools, baskets at their feet. Their voices falter at first, but soon spill freely. One is weary from bearing 6 children in as many years, her back bent, her belly hollow. The other is young, her marriage fresh, her face pale with the thought of a cradle too soon. They do not speak of contraception, not openly. That word would burn their tongues. Instead, they murmur of rest, of spacing, of not yet. The midwife nods, as though she has heard these phrases 1,000 times before. Because she has. She moves to her shelves, selecting sprigs of pennyroyal, a pouch of rue, and a chipped jar of savin resin. She grinds them slowly in a mortar, the sound like distant thunder. The mixture gives off a minty sharp aroma that stings the nose. She pours boiling water from the pot and stirs, muttering instructions. A cup before dawn, no more than 3 mornings. Rest after. Speak of it to no one but God. The women nod, their hands trembling as they accept the cups. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Midwives in medieval Europe occupied a unique position. They were vital to childbirth, but also the keepers of remedies for fertility, miscarriage, and contraception. The Trotula texts of Salerno, among others, contain references to midwives' practices, sometimes respectful, sometimes suspicious. Church authorities both relied on and distrusted them, fearing their independence. Historians still argue whether midwives were mainly community healers or whether they were scapegoated as witches when things went wrong. The truth, likely, is both. The first woman sips her tea and grimaces. Bitterness curls her tongue. She mutters that it tastes like chewing bark. The midwife smiles wryly and hands her a honeycomb chip to chew after, a small mercy. The second woman cradles her cup as though it's both poison and salvation. She drinks in small gulps, eyes darting to the door as though the priest might burst in at any moment. Quirky tidbit? Some records tell of midwives tying knots in cords or girdles while reciting psalms, then untying them only when danger had passed. One story from Northern Europe even describes a midwife whispering the Lord's Prayer backward over a woolen belt to prevent conception. Was it medicine, magic, or theater? To the women, it hardly mattered. The jokes creep in, because without them, the air here would smother. First, if medieval Yelp had reviews, midwives would top the list. 5 stars, delivered my baby in record time, threw in free birth control advice, would hire again. Second, imagine priests complaining that midwives were stealing their popularity, like influencers pulling followers from the pulpit. Third, a husband overhearing his wife's whispered instructions might think she was cursing him rather than saving herself. Darling, what did you just mutter about rue and vinegar? But you can't laugh for long. The stakes in this cottage are too high. For every woman who leaves with hope, another returns with grief. A child lost, a potion that failed, a body weakened by too much tea. And when tragedy strikes, who bears the blame? Often the midwife. She has been both revered and reviled, hailed as savior when births go well, accused of witchcraft when they don't. The scholarly debate hums through the smoke. Some argue midwives were simply indispensable, tolerated because no priest or physician would stoop to blood and cries. Others insist midwives were targets of suspicion, their knowledge dismissed as superstition unless confirmed by a man with a university seal. The truth, again, lies in the braid. Communities trusted them because they had to, and authorities feared them because they couldn't control them. The day lengthens, and more women arrive. One brings a newborn for blessing, swaddled tight, its eyes still unfocused. Another comes weeping, clutching her belly with both hands, seeking a draught to end a pregnancy she cannot feed. The midwife listens to each in turn, her voice steady, her instructions practical. She does not judge. Her role is not to ask why, but to ensure survival. By afternoon, her apprentice joins her. A girl barely 16, hair wild, eyes wide with both awe and dread. She watches as the midwife grinds herbs, measures powders, and tests the heat of oil with her fingertip. She learns not just recipes, but gestures, how to hold a trembling hand, how to nod at the right moment, how to let silence do the work. Knowledge here is passed not by parchment, but by repetition, by watching and remembering, by trust. The hours pass in rhythm, grinding, pouring, whispering, comforting. By evening, the floor is littered with herb stems, the air thick with steam. The midwife's scarf is damp with sweat, her hands stained green. She wipes them on her apron, ties her jars shut, and leans heavily on the table. Yet when a knock sounds at the door, she straightens again, because she knows her work is never finished. Outside, the sky bruises purple, stars pushing through the veil of dusk. You step into the cool air and glance back at the cottage, glowing faintly with firelight. To the men in the tavern, that glow is ordinary, unremarkable. But to the women of the village, it is a beacon. It says, here is knowledge, here is choice, here is someone who listens. And that, perhaps, is why midwives were both loved and feared. They held power in a world that denied it to women. They knew the secrets of the body, the herbs of the field, the prayers that soothed, the knots that bound. Their knowledge was never written cleanly into books, but lived on in whispers and hands. And for countless women, that was enough to survive. The night deepens. A fox yips beyond the hedgerow. Somewhere, a baby cries, then quiets. And in the cottage at the village's edge, the midwife stirs her pot again, steady as ever, keeper of secrets, guardian of choices. She has no saint's halo, no title, no parchment, only her hands, her herbs, her courage, and sometimes that is enough to change everything. The moon is a thin coin tonight, silver and sharp against a sky the color of soot. The village sleeps, but a monastery on the hill still glows with candlelight, windows spilling soft squares of gold into the darkness. You walk the winding path up toward its heavy doors, curious about what is kept within. Because not all knowledge of contraception in the Middle Ages stayed in cottages and gardens. Some of it bled into manuscripts, copied carefully by monks who pretended their quills weren't recording dangerous things. Tonight, you enter that world of scholars debating ancient texts, weighing each word as though it might tip the balance between sin and science. Inside, the scriptorium hums faintly. A dozen monks bend over parchment, their heads shaved into tonsures, their eyes tired but intent. Goose feather quills scratch rhythmically, dipping into ink, pausing, lifting again. The air smells of vellum and lamp oil with just a trace of smoke. The silence is broken only by the shuffle of sandals and the occasional sneeze from dust. One monk squints at a thick codex, tracing a line of Latin with his finger. Ad conceptum vitandum, to avoid conception. He frowns, writes it down, then pauses, looking nervously at the abbot before continuing. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval medical manuscripts, especially those descended from classical sources, contained passages on contraception, though cloaked in vague or coded language. Texts like the Trotula from Salerno mention herbs, pessaries, and timing methods, while translations of Galen and Hippocrates carried earlier knowledge into the Middle Ages. Yet scribes often annotated these passages with warnings or moral notes, reflecting the tension between preserving knowledge and condemning its use. Historians still argue whether monks copied such recipes out of scholarly duty, curiosity, or secret sympathy. On a desk nearby, you notice a margin note. Tiny, crabbed letters squeezed between the lines. It reads, "This may aid women, but beware, for it leads to sin." The contradiction is striking. Knowledge preserved, but hedged with judgment. Another monk has underlined a passage on pennyroyal and written simply, "Dubium est," it is doubtful. You realize that even within these cloisters, debates smoldered quietly, half science, half sermon. Quirky tidbit? In one manuscript, a scribe doodled a tiny plant in the margin, likely rue, complete with little leaves. Some scholars believe monks decorated even the most forbidden remedies with care, as though unable to resist the charm of the subject. Imagine spending hours copying a recipe you're not supposed to approve of, and then adding a flourish like a cheeky smile in the corner. You glance around and imagine the jokes these solemn men would never dare voice aloud. So, you provide them yourself. First, monks probably invented passive-aggressive footnotes. "I copied this heretical recipe, but don't blame me if you use it." Second, picture confession. "Forgive me, Father, I may have drawn an adorable rue plant in the book of forbidden knowledge." Third, if medieval universities had plagiarism checks, half the monastery would get flagged for copying contraceptive recipes from Galen without proper citation. But beneath the humor, the stakes feel heavy. These monks weren't just scribes. They were gatekeepers of memory. Without them, much of ancient medicine, good or bad, would have vanished. Their caution, their reluctance, even their hypocrisy ensured that future generations still had fragments to argue over. And argue they did. The scholarly debate in your ear grows sharper. Some historians argue that these texts were purely academic, copied to preserve knowledge, not to endorse it. Others suggest the monks knew villagers, especially midwives, needed this information, and copying it was an act of reluctant service. Still others believe scribes copied indiscriminately, treating contraception recipes no differently than charms against headaches. The truth, as always, is entangled. Morality and medicine braided into the same manuscript. As the night deepens, you wander to another desk, where a younger monk pores over a text by Aristotle. He murmurs aloud, "That conception depends on the strength of seed and the timing of the monthly flow." His tone is uncertain, skeptical. His neighbor shakes his head and mutters a counter-argument from Galen. You realize you're watching an age-old academic quarrel. Two monks debating fertility like students cramming for exams, except their examiners are both God and history, the candle gutters, and the abbot enters, his robes brushing the floor. He surveys the room, his eyes lingering on the open manuscripts. "Copy faithfully," he warns, "but remember, some knowledge is a temptation." The monks bow, but their hands return to the pages. The quills scratch on, preserving, doubting, condemning, yet never discarding. Outside, the monastery bells toll softly, calling for midnight prayer. You step into the courtyard, where the air is cold and the stars burn bright. Behind those walls, knowledge is still being copied, argued, and hidden in plain sight. And you realize something profound. The survival of medieval contraceptive knowledge owed as much to cautious monks as to daring midwives. Without one, the other would have had nothing to build on. And here's the irony. The very church that condemned contraception also preserved its recipes, tucked into vellum and guarded in monasteries. That paradox hums in the night, as steady as the bells, as quiet as the turning stars. The morning fog clings to the earth as though it doesn't want to let go. Crows circle overhead, their cries harsh, like arguments carried on the wind. You follow the path out of the village square and into a small cluster of cottages where whispers live longer than sunlight. Today, those whispers are heavy with dread, because this is the chapter where risk and punishment press hardest upon women's shoulders, where failed herbs lead to swollen bellies, and swollen bellies lead to scandal, hunger, or worse. You step into a cottage where a young woman sits by the hearth, her eyes hollow, her hands clenched around a wooden spoon she doesn't use. Her mother scolds her gently, urging her to eat. But the truth is visible. The rue tea failed, the pennyroyal didn't work, and the wool pessary proved only hope without certainty. Her belly swells despite all her prayers. She whispers that she is unmarried, that the father has gone on pilgrimage, that her life is finished. Her mother's silence confirms it. In this world, an unintended pregnancy is not just a burden, it is a sentence. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In medieval Europe, women who bore children outside marriage often faced harsh punishments. Depending on region and period, they could be fined, publicly shamed, or even executed for infanticide if the child died. The church and local courts saw sexuality outside marriage as sin, but it was women, rarely men, who bore the brunt of consequences. Historians still argue whether harsh laws reflected real enforcement or whether many communities quietly looked the other way unless scandal grew too large. The young woman rocks slowly, whispering she wishes the tea had been stronger, that the midwife had given her more. Her words sting because you know, too much pennyroyal could have killed her. She sat between two dangers, pregnancy and poison, and chose the risk she thought smaller. Now, she faces both. Quirky tidbit: some communities believed that if a woman stepped over a grave while pregnant out of wedlock, the child would be born cursed. So elders forbade unmarried women from graveyards altogether, as though superstition could shame them into obedience. You imagine funerals where half the village looks at the young girls, not the coffin, watching for any who avoid the graves too carefully. You can't help but release a dark laugh or two, because humor keeps you from drowning in the weight. First, medieval men were essentially the inventors of the disappearing act, fleeing on pilgrimage, crusade, or trade at the exact moment responsibility arrived. Second, if gossip were a commodity, these villages could have traded it like salt. One scandal for 2 bags of barley, deal? Third, the safest contraceptive, grimly enough, was probably poverty itself. Hunger dampen desire faster than sermons. But the jokes don't hold long. In the village square, a crowd gathers near the stocks. A girl stands with her hair shorn, her hands bound, a sign hung around her neck reading "Fornicator." Children throw mud, men mutter, women turn away with faces tight from recognition. She is punished, not because she is unique, but because she is unlucky. Someone talked, someone envied, and now she pays the price. The scholarly debate murmurs like a low fire. Some historians argue that such punishments were rare, invoked mainly to make examples. Others suggest they were far more common, a routine cruelty that shaped women's lives through fear. The truth may be that fear itself was the real tool. Punishment didn't need to happen often if everyone believed it might. You walk away from the stocks, your boots heavy in the mud. Past the tavern, you find a midwife's cottage, its door shut tight. Inside, women sit together, whispering what to do if someone is discovered with herbs or teas. They share tricks, hide jars and flour sacks, call pennyroyal mint for fevers, pretend rue is for cooking. Every strategy is a shield, flimsy but better than none. And yet, when herbs fail, when bellies swell, sometimes the only desperate option is darker still. You've heard the stories. Infants left at monastery doors, children smothered in silence, young mothers vanishing into the woods, and the punishments that follow: trials, executions, exile, hang over every whispered recipe. In some towns, women accused of abortion or infanticide were paraded with hot irons or drowned in rivers, their crime etched into the memory of every girl watching. Still, women kept trying. Because hunger was real, childbirth was deadly, and too many mouths could doom a family. You sit by the hearth again and hear a mother tell her daughter that better to risk rue than to bury another baby in the frost. The daughter nods, though her eyes are wide with terror. You realize knowledge here is never neutral. It is always tinged with fear. The sun dips, and the village falls quiet. Dogs bark once and fall silent. You stand at the edge of the green, where gallows cast long shadows. You imagine how many women walked past them with rue tucked in their skirts, with pennyroyal hidden in their sleeves, pretending their bundles were innocent. And you know the truth. The punishments were not just legal, they were social. Every glance, every whisper, every shorn head was a sentence. Because humor insists on having the last word, you let one final laugh out. Imagine a medieval lawyer. "Your Honor, my client didn't drink pennyroyal tea. She was just very committed to herbal wellness." Or a priest grumbling, "If only sin smelled less like vinegar and rue, I could catch them easier." Even a gallows joke, grim as it is. This rope is the only contraceptive men actually fear. The stars prick through the dark, cold, and distant. You realize women carried risk on every path. Risk in drinking, risk in abstaining, risk in trusting men, risk in trusting herbs. And when those risks tipped against them, punishment followed. Not for the act itself, but for daring to try to control their bodies. The gallows and stocks weren't just punishments. They were warnings, written into wood and rope, that echoed across centuries. And yet, in whispers and kitchens and cottages, women still brewed, still tied charms, still sought ways to carve control from fear. The punishments could terrify, but they never silenced. And that resilience, quiet and stubborn, is perhaps the truest survival of all. The night is cool, a kind of hush that feels older than the cobblestones beneath your feet. You leave behind the cramped cottages, the smoky hearths, the whispered prayers over rue and pennyroyal. Your steps carry you further, beyond the fields, beyond the hedgerows, until the village seems smaller than a lantern flickering in memory. And as you look back, you begin to see the long thread that stretches forward, from those hidden gardens of the Middle Ages all the way into your own world. The legacies of those whispered contraceptives echo not as curiosities trapped in parchment, but as roots buried deep, still feeding the present. You pause by a stream, watching the moon's reflection ripple across the water. It feels right that so much of medieval knowledge flowed like this. Fragmented, distorted, but never lost. For every potion brewed in secrecy, every charm stitched into skirts, every tea disguised as medicine, something survived. Some practices lived on as folklore, others as the seed of modern science, others only as warnings. But all of them form the soil where present-day knowledge grew. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Many of the plants medieval women used, rue, pennyroyal, savin, tansy, remained in contraceptive lore well into the 19th century. Medical historians trace a direct line between these medieval remedies and the herbal contraceptives whispered among women in early modern Europe and colonial America. Historians still argue whether these remedies had measurable efficacy or whether their legacy is more cultural than medical. But the continuity is undeniable. Women remembered, women adapted, women passed the knowledge on. You imagine a midwife's hand placing a rue sprig in her granddaughter's palm, saying, "This is for fevers and for what we do not name." The girl grows, whispers the same to her daughter, and so the chain stretches centuries. Knowledge didn't live in books alone. It lived in kitchens, gardens, and gossip, surviving inquisitions, witch hunts, and sermons. And somehow, that fragile thread reached modern times. Quirky tidbit: in some rural parts of Europe, women carried rue and pennyroyal as lucky herbs, even into the 20th century. They claimed it kept away evil spirits, but the wink in their eyes suggested another layer of meaning. Folklore became camouflage. Imagine an herb bundle pinned on a blouse in 1900, grandmother insisting it was for luck, while granddaughter understood perfectly well what kind of luck she meant. Humor insists on joining this reflection, so here come your three. First, medieval contraceptives walked so modern birth control pills could run, though the marketing back then was much less catchy. Second, imagine an herbalist from 1350 seeing today's pharmacy shelves. All these boxes, and not a single one smells like goat dung? Unbelievable. Third, if medieval women had Instagram, their posts would be #pennyroyal_challenge. And half the comments would be doctors saying, "Please don't." But behind the jokes, you feel the weight of continuity. The struggle for control over fertility is not ancient history. It's a thread that winds through every generation. Women brewed teas in the 14th century, whispered recipes in the 18th, and fought for legal contraceptives in the 20th. Each act, each whisper, each risk was a step on the same path. The scholarly debate echoes one last time. Some historians argue medieval contraceptive practices were mostly symbolic, more comfort than cure. Others insist that even imperfect methods mattered because they represented agency. The truth is likely both. Herbs may have failed often, but the act of trying was itself revolutionary. Each attempt, successful or not, was a refusal to surrender entirely to fate, a statement that women's bodies were not just vessels for God, men, or the state. You walk further into a meadow touched by moonlight. Fireflies spark around you, tiny lanterns blinking. It feels as though the spirits of all those women, midwives, mothers, daughters, are walking with you. Their whispers linger, some proud, some fearful, some bitter, some hopeful. They remind you that the fight for choice is not new. It is as old as rue sprigs crushed in mortar, as old as tally sticks notched with moons, as old as the hush of secrecy. And here is the irony that history leaves you with. Those medieval remedies were often ineffective, sometimes dangerous, and yet their true legacy is not in chemistry, but in defiance. Women dared to try. They dared to risk. They dared to remember. And that daring, passed on in whispers, is what survived. You turn one last time toward the village in the distance. Its roofs glimmer faintly under the stars. Its gardens tucked in darkness. Its cottages holding countless secrets. Then you face forward toward the present, toward the pharmacies, the clinics, the open conversations, toward the battles still being fought, echoes of the same struggle. And you realize we are never as far from the Middle Ages as we think. The herbs may have changed, the punishments may have shifted, but the core, control, choice, survival, remains the same. So you walk on under the moon, the thread of history wound tight around your wrist, carrying both memory and hope. The journey tonight has been long, winding through gardens heavy with rue, kitchens steaming with bitter teas, monasteries echoing with whispered debates, and cottages glowing with midwives' quiet defiance. You've carried the scent of pennyroyal, the sting of vinegar, the rattle of charms, and the fear of punishments that once shadowed every step. And now, as the night deepens, it's time to set it all down gently, like laying aside a heavy cloak at the end of a long road. You lie back, and the sounds soften. The clatter of market stalls fades into the memory of fireflies blinking over a meadow. The sharp taste of herbs dissolves, replaced by the sweetness of candle wax melting slowly on a table. Even the harsh sermons and the scratching of monks' quills become something quieter, like distant rain tapping on old wood. History is still there, but the edges blur. The weight lightens, and you are left only with a rhythm, steady and calm. Take a breath. Let it fill you, warm as a hearth fire. Let it go, slow as smoke rising into the beams of a cottage roof. Imagine the midwife's steady hands, not busy with herbs or cups now, but simply resting, folded in her lap. Imagine the moon above, no longer a stern timekeeper of cycles, but a gentle lantern hanging in the dark, watching over you. The struggles, the fears, the whispered bargains of the past drift further away until they are no more than echoes. What remains is resilience, the quiet strength of countless voices layered one upon another, carrying you into rest. So close your eyes. Let the thread of history cradle you. Sleep comes, soft as wool, steady as breath, certain as dawn.